In this series, we will be covering the totality of the last 200 and some odd years of the history of socialism. That is to say, the history of our movements, where we were then and where we are now. But before we can talk about the history of socialism, we must briefly touch upon the history of liberalism, more specifically the French Revolution and the significance that it poses to our movements. The French Revolution marks the exodus from France out from monarchical rule and feudalism towards early capitalism and liberal democracy, an event that would act as a catalyst for many of the neighboring colonial powers to follow suit in the centuries to come. A litany of factors contributed to the French Revolution, from France's involvement in the American Revolution to a growing population that the feudal economic mode was incapable of providing means of subsistence for, leaving many destitute and impoverished, to King Louis XVI's lavish spending and way of life, poor harvests, drought, soaring prices of bread, etc. On the cusp of the revolution, the royal coffers were empty, and France was on the verge of bankruptcy. Civil unrest was on the rise with widespread looting, rioting, and striking. France at the time was divided between three estates in the realm, also known as the Ancient Regime. The first estate being the clergy, the second estate being the crown and the nobles, and the third estate being the peasants and middle class. Oftentimes during the estate general assemblies, since voting power of the groups was determined by their status within the hierarchy, the first and second estates, that is, the clergy and nobility, would vote against and overrule the interests of the commons on repeated occasions, jading public policy, wealth distribution, and political power in favor of the ruling classes against the oppressed classes. The class divide between middle-class proletariat, peasantry, the clergy, and the noble aristocracy grew increasingly sharp, with only 2% of the population belonging to the blue-blooded or men of the cloth, and the rest belonging to the oppressed and deprived classes. Times were desperate, and the nobility were beginning to see the writing on the wall. So in a meeting scheduled on May 5th, 1789, the king and his subjects were to sit down and discuss the implementation of some redistributive tax policies to ramp up the welfare state. During this time, to the buildup of the meeting, the Third Estate demanded political reform that would grant their class equal voting rights via the abolition of the noble veto, since the First and Second Estates could always overrule the will of the commons. However, limited reforms such as extended voting rights and mild wealth redistribution went too far for the most reactionary sects of the ruling class, and on the 12th of July, word had spread that there were plans by such sects to shut down the assembly for popular reform by force, circumventing the democratic will of the commons. This news, combined with the fact that what little political reform was coming to pass was too little too late, angered the masses and sparked the events that would lead to the overthrow of the ancient regime and the storming of the Bastille. On June 14th, popular insurrectionists coalesced and proceeded to storm the Bastille fortress to raid the fort for arms and ordnance. Hysteria and insurrectionary groups swelled across the countryside. Several hours into the battle, Governor Marquis de Launay capitulated to the attackers, was captured by the insurrectionists, and executed by guillotine in front of the Hôtel de Ville. An event that marked such a pivotal moment in French history that the date of this attack has become a national holiday in France. The public debate over suffrage reform exploded following this period, and tensions between the Third and First and Second Estates were beginning to grow hostile. On June 17th, the Third Estate adopted the title of National Assembly, representing the interests of the French peasantry and bourgeoisie. 3 days later, they met in a tennis court and took what was called the Tennis Court Oath, vowing not to dissolve until constitutional reform had been met. On August 4th, 1789, the National Assembly coalesced to abolish feudalism and, with the help of Thomas Jefferson, would draft the Declaration of the Right of Man and of Citizen, a new constitution of sorts based heavily on the ideas of the Enlightenment philosophers such as Rousseau, Locke, and Voltaire. Some of these ideas include secularism, freedom of thought, free trade, individual freedom, egalitarianism, and phrases such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Over the next 2 years, things would grow more calm as legislative reform was being debated upon and passed. On the 14th of July, 1790, The Fête de la Fédération was held in France, commemorating a year since Bastille Day, a countrywide festival of sorts that even King Louis and his family turned out for. Despite this show of unity, however, the struggle between competing political factions would only swell over time. The most prominent of the political factions of this time were the Jacobins Club, initially founded in 1789 as an anti-monarchy faction in favor of the establishment of an authoritarian democratic state, as well as a number of radically progressive policies for the time. One of the most influential members of the Jacobins was Maximilien Robespierre, who was one of the head statesmen of the insurrectionary Paris Commune, which would be established in 1792. Robespierre was a believer in the cult of supreme being, a kind of deism instituted as an alternative state religion to Roman Catholicism, since the church at the time was actively embedding the monarchy. In the next couple of years that followed the national assemblies and the implementation of popular political reform, the legitimacy of the monarchy itself had come into question, since King Louis had refused repeatedly on multiple occasions to accept limitations to his power and actively fought to reverse concessions, along with the repeated failure by the monarchical government to provide food and work. And in the constitution that was drafted as is, property qualifications barred a significant number of the population from being able to vote, restricting support to the new constitution in the National Assembly. Within the assembly, there were three sects: the constitutional monarchists led by Bernard, who wanted to preserve the crown, the left-wing Jacobins led by Brissot, who were in favor of the abolition of monarchy, and finally the center-wing faction, which were a toss-up on the issue. The Jacobins, however, were able to rally sympathy for their cause by portraying King Louis as hostile to the revolution, baiting him to use his veto repeatedly on progressive policy. And in October and November of 1791, the Assembly passed measures to seize the property of nobles whom had fled the revolution to Austria and Prussia during the revolution, as well as the surrender of priests who were threatening civil war in southern France, opposing the Assembly's decree, giving them 8 days to comply or face charges of being counter-revolutionary. King Louis would go on to veto them both. Following was a campaign by the Brissotins against Austria and Prussia to get them to turn in the noble emigrants whom were in exile in the two respective countries building counter-revolutionary forces. And following this campaign, the Legislative Assembly would declare war on Prussia and Austria, marking the beginning of the French Revolutionary Wars. On the domestic front, Jacobin insurrectionists would attack the royal residence in Paris and take the king captive on August 10, 1792. The following month, hundreds of accused counter-revolutionaries would be tried and executed, and the Legislative Assembly was replaced by the National Convention, and the abolition of the monarchy would be declared, as well as the establishment of the French Republic. And on January 21, 1793, King Louis XVI would be sentenced to death by guillotine. Following the death of the king, France as a nation would descend into a state of chaos and disarray. During this time, the radically left-wing Jacobins would struggle for power against the more moderate Girondins, and would gain political dominance over this period. After the Jacobins seized control of the National Convention, shortly afterwards they would institute the Reign of Terror, a 10-month campaign of mass political violence and repression where suspected counter-revolutionaries would be arrested, tried, and executed. Robespierre would lead the charge against the enemies of the revolution, and over the course of the terror, political policies were implemented that would rein in the influence of suspected enemies of the people, from price controls on consumer goods, to the establishment of a new calendar, to the outlawing of Christianity, and the institution of capital punishment for hoarders and profiteers. Revolutionary groups were established to enforce draconian measures against counter-revolution amongst the populace. On the 10th of October, the National Convention recognized the Committee of Public Safety as the supreme law of the land, and suspended the Constitution for the rest of the terror. Political leaders, dissidents, and high-class individuals were promptly tried and guillotined over the course of the terror. And as time went on, the push to find enemies expanded from Paris into the countryside. The logic for the terror would become self-justifying. State policy would grow ever more draconian, and it eventually got to the point where one could be arrested on mere suspicion of being a counter-revolutionary, even if they were vocal supporters of the new regime. Robespierre would be the one to lead the charge on the revolutionary violence during this time, until he himself would be tried and executed on the 28th of July, 1794. As many as 17,000 people were executed over the course of the Terror, and an untold thousands more had died in prison without trial. And in reaction to the mass violence of the Terror, southern France saw an upsurge in revenge killings against Jacobins, Republican officials, and Protestants. This period would be known as the Thermidorian Reaction, which was a series of uprisings against the Jacobins and the new regime. In reaction to persistent food shortages, growing war debts, and a stagnating economy, the seeds of betrayal of the revolution had been sown. In 1795, a committee comprised largely of Girondin opposition to the Jacobins would draft a new constitution which would slow down the political process in France and grant executive power to the 5-member directory appointed by Parliament. Royalists and Jacobins were repressed silently by the army, led by a young Napoleon Bonaparte. From 1795 to 1799, political and economic instability would only continue under the Directory, and time again they would rely on brute force via the army to repress widespread discontent from below. Over the next 4 years, the Directory would manipulate elections, barring elected deputies from taking their seats, and exiling members of political opposition. Corruption was rampant, and more France would begin to resemble a military dictatorship until November 9th, 1799, this transformation would be complete, as Bonaparte would stage a coup d'etat abolishing the Directory and appointing himself as the new head of state. This would end the Council of 500 as well as the Council of the Directory. Under Napoleon Bonaparte, France would become an empire waging war across Europe, throughout the Middle East, and into Russia, overthrowing monarchies, building alliances, and conquering new territories. Bonaparte, over the next 15 years of his rule, would go down in history as one of the most famous generals and tacticians to have ever lived. That is, until his death in 1814, and the Bourbon restoration of monarchy that followed. The reason why I marked the French Revolution as the first episode of this series is because of the significance that it carries as a massive influence on left-wing thinkers and philosophers for centuries to come. Marx and Engels were heavily inspired by the French Revolution, and derived a great deal of influence from the very liberal philosophers that the French revolutionaries based their very constitutional principles upon, as well as the utopian French socialists that were very prominent during this period. This historical event represents one of humanity's pivotal breaks away from the feudal economic mode and the coinciding rise of capitalist society and large-scale industrialization. Because despite the fact that this break from the old way technically failed in the sense that the French revolutionaries weren't ultimately able to deliver on their promises, the political systems that they set up were riddled with deficiencies, the logical conclusions of which led to France becoming an expansionist empire and eventually descending back into monarchical rule after Napoleon's death. It was still an overwhelmingly progressive event, as it was the realization that the wealth and power of humanity didn't reside within the coffers of the crown or the men of the cloth, but rather the general wealth shared among nations.